Dan Ujczo, thank you for joining me.
Good afternoon.
So you've just come back from convening 60 stakeholder groups from across Canada and the United States, businesses, think tankers, scholars, associations, all coming together to talk about the state of the Canada-US relationship. What was the mood?
Well, there's cautious optimism that we have the state visit and then now the North American Leaders Summit, but there's also a great deal of frustration that we keep doing the same things over and over and over again in the Canada-US world, and there's just a call by these 60 to 70 organizations we have to do things different again. We have to start looking at a way to advance Canada-US and speak in a new language about the bilateral relationship and start, doing things that will allow us to move policies forward. I mean, we've had some great ideas that have been in the pipelines over the past several years, but they've been stuck in a pipeline because of a pipeline, the debate.
Well, the pipeline's gone now, so what's frustrating you?
Well, the frustration is that we run from one dispute to the other. I previously worked in the U.S. government, the Canadian government. I've managed a trade association. I'm now back to the dark side of private law practice. And what you see from the Canada-U.S. relationship, and all of us that talk about these things, we run from one issue and we resolve it. And we do it without a war or anything like that. That's the great story of Canada-U.S., right? We don't go into conflict or anything like that. But then we move right to the next issue. And nobody builds the underlying infrastructure that's needed to manage this relationship. So while it's great that we have two leaders that have the bromance, and we had Irish eyes are smiling, back in Mulrooney and Reagan's days, we really have to ask the question, is that the way to manage the world's most important two-way relationship? Just do two people get along? And the question is, what do we as the stakeholder and business communities need to do to come up with new ways to manage that? And that's what we spent the last 3 days talking about.
So what kind of infrastructure are you looking for?
Well, one is that this was the first time ever that all of the Canada-US groups based in Washington, Ottawa, but most importantly out in places like Detroit, Windsor, and Columbus, Ohio, and Arizona, and North Carolina, et cetera, all came together under one roof. I mean, we recognize that all politics is local in the U.S., and as we've started to say more, all trade is personal, that it's those everyday stories that are going to make the relationship between Canada and the U.S. really as vibrant as it is. That's what it's at the individual level. And so what we need to do is make sure that those stakeholder communities in places like Phoenix, Arizona, or Columbus, Ohio, as I said, or Nashville, Tennessee, that those folks are pulling together the Canada-U.S. community, so when legislators go back to their districts or the community writ large or the media and others are reporting and recognizing how vibrant this relationship is. We have to acknowledge that the Americans don't really understand the importance of Canada to their relationship. Candidly, our Canadian friends think they know more about the United States than they do, and so it's our job is to bridge that gap. And so that's what we were talking about.
But out in Phoenix, out in Ohio, outside the gates of these leaders' meetings, people are turning to a lot of anti-trade rhetoric. I mean, look at Donald Trump, look at Bernie Sanders, and now Hillary Clinton saying she's not in favor of the TPP, and Trump saying NAFTA was this devastating thing for the U.S. economy. How worried should Canadians be about the mood here in the U.S.?
Well, that's precisely why we held the event in Columbus, Ohio, because Ohio is the battleground state. It is the bellwether. Historically, all political leaders, whether it was President Obama on his first campaign or not, run through Ohio and start raising NAFTA because it is truly the bellwether state. So that's why we were there. We had the chairman of the Ohio Republican Party there, which, as you know, Cleveland will host. Ohio will host the Ohio Republican Convention, the National Convention, excuse me. And so we also had Secretary Clinton surrogates there as well, Governor Blanchard and others there. And so that was it, to take the pulse. And the reality is I'm from Ohio. I grew up in Youngstown, Ohio, which is kind of like Hamilton, just not as nice, where NAFTA is not a four-letter word, but it's usually preceded or followed by one. So the trade sentiment does bounce back and forth. And what we have said, and we had Undersecretary of State Novelli there, who's running the Obama administration's outreach efforts to the Midwest on TPP. And the fact in our discussions was that you can't do the big job numbers, job creation, and ignoring some of the job displacement isn't going to solve the trade issues. So what you have to do is first personalize it. Columbus, Ohio is home to one of the largest retail sectors. Abercrombie and Fitch, Limited Brands, Victoria's Secret are all headquartered there. I question how many of the employees there think of themselves as involved in international trade while they're getting on planes and traveling around the world to do those types of things. Similarly with Procter & Gamble and elsewhere. So what we need to do is really at a company by company and ultimately at a person by person level, start the trade message to understand, because just throwing out how many jobs are created isn't going to do it. Additionally, one of the things that we continue to talk about is we have to recognize that there are winners and losers in places like Ohio and Pittsburgh and Indianapolis and elsewhere. And so one of the talks is, how do we bundle up a stimulus package on infrastructure? We know that we have decrepit infrastructure or falling apart infrastructure in the United States. Just try to fly out in any one of our airports when you're sitting on the tarmac 3 or 4 hours. So perhaps launching a trade agenda that also comes with it infrastructure that can create jobs. Because if I'm 55, I'm not going back to get trade adjustment assistant. It's just not going to happen. I'm not going to get into the tech sector. But what are those types of things that we can do to move forward? And those are the types of solutions that need to be talked. Just coming out here and throwing broad policy statements that this many jobs are created by NAFTA isn't going to do it. We really have to make sure that we're selling it, and not just when we're trying to pitch a trade agreement. That has to be an every day, each and every day, and that's where it comes on us in the business community. And so companies like Campbell Soup are doing great things within the company to get out there and have their plant managers talk to their employees about how many of their jobs are depending on trade. We had a situation down in South Carolina, which we thought was, comical if it wasn't tragic, that somebody was screaming out there saying, anti-trade, anti-trade. She was a BMW employee, right? She's working for a German company in South Carolina, but screaming anti-trade, not recognizing that her job depends on those supply and value chains.
Given the anger, the frustration, the anti-trade sentiment that's being stoked up by this presidential season, is that enough? Is going out there and talking to employees, is that enough? What else could you be doing?
Well, we have to talk to employees. We also have to make sure that our media, our partners in the media, are featuring stories. So that's one of the things that we're doing in an orchestrated effort, is our various organizations will be championing stories of where CanadaUS investments come in. So when a Canadian company comes into a community and creates 500 jobs, as we see down in Nashville and elsewhere, that's being covered in the media as an international trade project. Those types of issues. And that's where we have to do it. This is going to be in person by person, hand to hand. It's not going to come from broad pronouncements, toasting a champagne glass and saying we want the TPP passed. It's not going to work in places like Ohio.
Well, what about elected officials? You have all these Republicans now. Trump is their standard bearer. This was the party of free trade. How do you get this voice heard in the political process?
Well, in that case, and that is one issue that, as we look at not only in trade but in CanadaUS generally, is what are the levers of influence within the United States? And one is votes, right? And right now in social media and elsewhere, the anti-trade sentiment is winning the day. There's just no question about that. My buddies that I grew up with working third shift back in Youngstown, Ohio, they're having their beers after work tweeting, anti-TPP. I'm confident most of them don't know what it is, but it's just what they're being told to tweet out. But so there's the votes issue, and in CanadaUS, Canadians, when they come to the United States, don't vote, right? They don't become U.S. citizens. In contrast to our friends from Mexico and elsewhere, when they come to the United States, often become part of the American fabric, can vote, but also care deeply what goes on back in their home country. So we almost have to check that for a moment. The other lever of influence in the United States is money. And we just have to understand fundamentally the important role that money plays in political campaigns in the United States. Now in Canada, there really wasn't a culture of lobbying for quite some time, not to the same extent. Money doesn't have its same influence. But what we do have are Canadian companies with U.S. subsidiaries located in virtually every congressional district. So the time has come to really look at a way to how do we coordinate that government relations strategy, not only going in there and saying we're your best friend. Canada's strategy for so long has been we're in a special relationship, we're your best friend. Well, now about 120 countries around the world come around every legislator and say the same thing. But Canada is in every congressional district. They're in every legislator's backyard, and they do have the capacity to provide funds to campaigns to help those people become elected and continue to serve their public. So one of our strategies will be to look at ways to coordinate that through something equivalent to a PAC or a super PAC or those types of things to make sure that there's money.
A CanadaUS super PAC for the first time I've ever heard that.
Yes, it wouldn't be quite a super PAC. I mean, there's various lobbying laws and those types of things, but the idea would be coordinating the Canadian funding that is being spent in Washington, D.C. at present. And there is a lot of funding being spent in Washington, but it's right now serving individual advocacy objectives, and what we want to do is coordinate that to become a much better and effective tool.
But I thought that non-Americans cannot contribute to American political campaigns. So what is your vision here?
That's the beauty of, that's what Canada has that very few countries around the world have, is that they have subsidiaries in the United States with U.S. citizens operating those that are legal entities under U.S. law, that they have their own budgets. It is, for all intents and purposes, they are U.S. companies. U.S. companies, U.S. entities that can contribute to political campaigns.
And what kind of response are you getting from these companies? Are they interested in participating?
Absolutely. Everybody recognizes, going back to our first question, is that we need to do something different. That just running around saying we're your best friend, running around, and while leaders' summits are wonderful, and I think there will be some great progress coming out of these, that unless there's the underlying infrastructure put in place, that this will be rhetoric without any action.
So CanadaPAC.
CanadaPAC is what it's called, CanadaUS PAC.
So as these leaders meet, what are they not talking about that you think they ought to be talking about?
Well, we're at a stage now in the 20 years and change since the North American Free Trade Agreement and the Free Trade Agreement earlier, where we have become a service economy. So we really, there was a lot of talk in each country about an innovation agenda, but what does that really look like? And key to that would be the actual movement of people. When we sell, just take for example, we always talk about the car parts that cross the border 8 to 12 times during the assembly process. Your average US made automobile has, its parts have crossed the border anywhere between 8 to 12 times during assembly. Well, now when you sell a piece of manufacturing equipment across the border, you're not only selling that, you're selling the individual that has to go install, train people how to use it, emergency repairs, all of those types of things. So all of the R&D, all the intellectual capital. Right now, it is a great challenge to move people across the Canada-US border. My day starts at 6 a.m. every day with calls from Pearson Airport with people being stopped at the border just as business visitors. Now, the Canadian government wants to reopen the NAFTA list of professionals on immigration, and I don't want to get into the reads here. Doing anything to reopen NAFTA is a non-starter in this political environment. But right now, business visitor rules, those things, when people just show up at the border, everybody's supposed to have a letter when you show up for business travel at the border saying how long you're going to be there and all of those types of things. How many people really do that? Not many. But they get turned around at the border. So what we're saying is just take a look at that. Those people that are crossing to look to make a sale, that are looking to raise venture capital, to do those types of things, let's just get some clarity on those rules because they're defined in field manuals. If we could clear that, that is the first person that a potential business owner or investor sees when they cross the border is somebody from CBSA or USCBP. We need to make that experience, while certainly beneficial to the security and ensuring security, but we also need to make it so that they can have some reliability that they're going there to make the sale, that they're doing those types of things. So business visitor travel right now is the bugaboo in Canada-US. Every company's complaining about it.
The Regulatory Cooperation Council, this was an effort by both countries to reduce a lot of unnecessary red tape, and how is that process going from your perspective?
This is the RCC, terrible name, it has a Sesame Street type name, regulatory cooperation, right? But it is the most important thing for the business community because it eliminates red tape, redundancy. Nobody's talking about adopting one standard over the other. It's just where there are two standards that both provide for health and safety and security, and they're pretty similar, but yet just have different issues. That let's either adopt one or come up with a new standard that incorporates both so that companies don't have to have these added costs of compliance. It took a few years to get the bureaucracy, because every bureaucrat and every regulator says my standard is the best. There's been great success in changing that mindset. But at the very time that it's ready to go, the government of Canada has moved that into the Treasury Board from the Privy Council office, and that has caused some deep concern within the business community as to how committed is the government of Canada to this process. The White House remains committed, but the individual that was running that process was a force of nature by the name of Bob Carberry, was a long-standing Canadian bureaucrat who is now retired. So we have issued a letter by virtually all 60 organizations calling for a recommitment to that RCC process. For all of the talk of the TPP and CETA and all of these this alphabet soup of trade negotiations, if we can get regulatory cooperation right between Canada and the United States, that will give us an advantage over every other country around the world, every other trade region and partnership, because that will allow us to truly to operate in the way that NAFTA envisioned back 20 years ago. That is the next NAFTA, not TPP.
A big agenda for you. Thank you so much, Dan.
Thank you.